Now, you and Rishi Sunak said at the beginning of going into government you wanted to under-promise and over-deliver. You said a while ago the economy was at a turning point, but now it seems we're in recession. And you dangled those chunky tax cuts. But now you're telling us there's no easy path. I mean, do you feel a bit silly that you went too far in nudging people that tax cuts might be on the way?
Well, first of all, I think you'll probably ask me about lots of specific taxes, whether the tourist tax that Rocco is campaigning very effectively on, or non-DOMs or national insurance. And obviously I can't talk about specific taxes ahead of the budget. But in terms of under-promising and over-delivering, when Rishi Sunak and I took over, inflation was 11%. It's gone down to 4%. It's fallen much faster than many people predicted. The Bank of England said we would have the longest recession in 100 years at that time. And in fact, it's been much more healthy, although we've just tipped on into a technical recession.
Yeah, just a technical recession. And the thing is as well is that whether or not we're in recession is not exactly relevant. It's a broader indicator that things aren't going well. But really and truly, did anything actually change materially when we got to the official figures showing that we were in recession 3 weeks ago, whatever it was, that the fateful Thursday when the figures came through? Or was it clear to everybody that the economy was in a shambles because we can't afford to live, public services are collapsing, shops are closing on our high streets, and the entire country feels miserable and everything sucks? Like, this is the real material issue that we should be talking about, because they might get out of this technical recession into like a small amount of growth, but is that growth going to be in asset prices and luxury purchases, or is it going to come from regular working people having more money to spend on consumption, like we should be if we had a proper growing economy, which we wouldn't be doing because these people are the government for asset owners. So they can look at some figures, they can point to some figures on some graphs and say, well, look, this shows that we're not technically in recession anymore, so things are going well, when people still can't afford to live. People's living standards haven't risen. Like, that's the real issue here. Whether or not we're in recession is completely irrelevant to me, as opposed to whether we are continually having the biggest drop in living standards since records began.
I think the economy has been much, much more resilient than people predicted.
And when it comes to, a lot of people watching feel that they've had a very hard time, but I'm asking you about the specific message that you've been sending, a message over the last few months that you were really eager to do tax cuts, and now actually you've got less money to spend than you hoped. Was it a mistake to raise people's expectations?
No, because what we have been saying very clearly is that when we look around the world, the economies that are growing fastest, whether it's North America or Asia, tend to be the ones with lower taxes. And we want that to be the case for the UK as well. But we've always said, and we've been very consistent, that we would only cut taxes in a way that was responsible and prudent. And if I may say, I think the most unconservative thing I could do would be to cut taxes by increasing borrowing, because that's just cutting taxes and saying that future generations have to pick up the tax. I won't do that. But I do want, where it's possible to do so responsibly, to move towards a lower tax economy. And I hope to show a path in that direction. But this will be a prudent and responsible budget for long-term growth, tackling inflation, more investment, more jobs, and that path to lower taxation as and when we can afford it.
But you've said also that the forecasts from the OBR, which is the economic watchdog that marks your homework, you've said that the numbers have gone against us. So the picture is bleaker than it was at the beginning of the year. Why then are you looking to cut tax now at all?
Well, these forecasts change the whole time.
Because we want to have something to run the election on. That's literally it. We want to cut taxes so that we have something to say that we did. Because at the end of the day, the Tories have 14 years and they have nothing. We got Brexit done. That's it. That's all they've got. All these years in office, nothing to show for it. So to try and run on the idea that taxes are still pretty high, it would be a complete non-starter for their traditional voter base who feel completely betrayed by them. And of course, on many issues, they have been.
What happened in the autumn was that the forecast went in our favour unexpectedly, quite close to the end. And so I was able to introduce the biggest business tax cut that people like the CBI said was a game changer that would fire up the British economy.
But I'm asking you about now. I mean, there are some people who look at the state of the economy and think actually now's not the time. You know, the IMF has said that, the CBI, the business group has said actually now isn't the time for short-term tax cuts. Some of your colleagues think also you shouldn't be doing it. You should instead be spending any spare cash on something hugely important like defence, for example. Is it not right to be looking to spend money in other places rather than scraping around for what might be quite small tax cuts?
Well, if we
Also, cutting national taxes means council tax needs to rise, which gives them a drum to beat in the next election after Starmer pisses into the wind for 4 years. Well, that's the thing as well, is that if council taxes go up, they're more likely to go up by a higher percentage in urban seats, which have far more pressing local authority spending concerns than rural seats do. Which are going to be the local authorities with higher population of homeless people. It's going to be in inner cities, which are going to have smaller budgets to work with. So they're going to have to increase their council tax more to be able to properly have enough money to meet their obligations in terms of local authority law.
We're going to spend more money on defence, as I believe we will need to do in the future. What we need to have is a healthily growing economy. Every decision that I take will be a prudent and responsible long-term decision. I mean, we're having a discussion earlier about the fiscal rules. And although I don't agree that we should change the fiscal rules, because I think people would interpret that as Britain losing control of its finances, I do very strongly agree with Andy that we need a long-term approach. That is what you'll see from what I announce in the budget. And what we do on tax will be linked to that. And I make no secret as a Conservative, I want to put money back into people's pockets, but I'll only do so in a way that is sensible, sustainable, and for the long term.
Just on the point.
And that's the thing, is actually Jeremy Hunt is probably the one that's closest to being sane on this. I know that people like Rishi Sunak are desperate for a tax cut for political reasons, but I think Jeremy Hunt knows that really and truly that's not going to work politically for them, even though they say, well, our Conservatives, we want to have low taxes. Even Conservative voters have been shown that they would rather any spare money would be spent on public services rather than giving them personally a tax cut, which is wild that that's even a Conservative position at this point. And also, I think I do agree that if a tax should get cut, it should be VAT, because a cut on VAT, it's something that does benefit consumers rather than investors.
Of those rules, though, I mean, it was interesting across this political spectrum on our panel. Our panelists were saying these are constraining you as the Chancellor. They are constraining the economy. Do you feel constrained? Do you feel that you're in something of a straitjacket, not just because of the rules, but also because of the OBR?
This sounds like a very probing question, doesn't it? Or do you feel like things are just a little bit too hard for you? Do you wish people gave you a break? No, skewer him. His party are the ones that have put our economy into this absolute mess from 14 years of mismanagement. And your question to him is, well, does it feel a little bit tight for you? Or is it difficult? Come on.
Economic watchdog breathing down your neck.
Well, for people at home, I think we should say, what are these rules? They're rules that governments decide to have. We don't have to have them. Some countries...
Yes, so you could change them.
We could change them. Some countries don't have them. The reason we have them is to give confidence to the British people and to the world that we are a country that pays back our debt. And if we didn't have them, people would worry that Britain was going to go on an endless borrowing binge, and we're not that sort of country. And in fact, I've taken very difficult decisions.
I mean, the polls show that people do want that, and it would be absolutely fine to go on a borrowing binge because we are a sovereign currency issuer. We need way more investment, which isn't coming from the private sector currently. And of course, we've had a massive dearth of investment for 14 years, as Caroline Lucas was saying, with the lowest in the G7 in terms of both public and private sector investment combined. So we do need to borrow to invest, because otherwise we will not get the growth that we need to. And you say, oh, well, the markets might be worried. As long as you can run out a plan of what you're going to be spending this borrowed money on, what your expected return on investment is, and how that's going to help and strengthen the national economy, there is absolutely zero reason whatsoever that bondholders would be scared and start selling up their bonds in case the price drops, as long as you can show that your investments are sound. Just like if you're going to a board of directors at a multinational company and say, we are taking on this extra debt to invest in extra capacity so that we can get better returns later, most companies would tell you that that was fine to go and do it. But as soon as it's the government, it's like, no, borrowing binge is bad. Think of what we're going to be putting on our future generations, even though we're a sovereign currency issuer and this isn't how national budgets work.
As Chancellor, to show the world that we are good for the money we borrow. And I wouldn't do anything that undermined that.
And people watching this morning will...
We will always be good for the money we borrow. We are a sovereign currency issuer, right? We have a central bank. We have literally the Bank of England. We have an unlimited supply of access to of new currency to ensure that bondholders can always be certain of being able to get return on investment. The only thing that really matters is inflation, productive capacity, and currency value. And as so little of our bonds are held in foreign currency denomination, most of our debt is in currency that we have a central bank for. We don't risk the cases of Weimar Germany, Zimbabwe, Yugoslavia, etc.
remember what happened in the autumn when your predecessor, Kwasi Kwarteng and Liz Truss, did ditch the OBR and promised billions of unfunded tax cuts, which indeed is what you then undid as soon as you got in the chair. Let's talk then about some of the specifics. Now, I know you are not going to confirm any specific tax cuts or not this morning, so let's not do that dance. However, we should tell our viewers...
We're going to do a different dance, are we?
Well, I know that you're a keen ballroom dancer, but maybe we won't quite get to that this morning. But we should tell viewers this morning, though, there is a widespread expectation that you are likely to cut national insurance. There's a widespread expectation also that you are going to nick Labour's policy of tightening up the rules for so-called non-DOMs, so people who earn huge fortunes over abroad but aren't permanent residents here. But I want to show viewers what you used to say about that idea. You said these are foreigners who could live easily in Ireland, France, Portugal or Spain. They all have these schemes. I would rather they stayed here and spent their money here. Do you want to take that back?
Well, as I said, Laura, I'm not going to talk about individual taxes.
No, I'm asking on principle.
Yeah, no,
do you disagree with Jeremy Hunt from 2022?
I don't disagree with Jeremy Hunt from nearly everything I've said in the past. But sometimes, let me say this: the country.
Sometimes people say things because it's politically expedient to do so, and they change their positions later on based on that same political expediency. See also the Labour Party leadership for the last 3 years.
Country sees through gimmicks, and we are not going to do gimmicks on Wednesday. It's going to be a budget for responsible long-term growth. When it comes to Labour, this is an election year, and people will see a contrast. We have a plan for growth that has seen us grow faster than any large European economy. Labour has just abandoned their plan for growth, their 28 billion.
We're speaking to Labour later in the programme.
See, they attack it on... He's even admitting, essentially, that it's a pro-growth plan. Literally admitting that spending 28 billion, going on the so-called borrowing binge, as he denigrated it earlier, would be a pro-growth measure. He is admitting it in front of us that the plans that Labour have now dropped would be good for growth, and is attacking Labour on dropping the policy rather than attacking the fact that they have it. It's incredible. Such a gigantic, gaping own goal, a goatsy of an own goal from the Labour Party to ditch the £28 billion spending pledge. People liked it, people wanted to see it happen, and they've not closed any of the attack lines for the Tories because they just hammer people for being U-turny and flip-floppy.
Rachel Reeves will be here next week, so we're not discussing Labour's economic policy.
No, but you mentioned Labour's policy, and that was what I was saying. The contrast with Labour is that we have halved unemployment. Their plans will destroy jobs because they want to give more additional burdens to employers. Their plans...
And there's no empirical evidence to show that stronger workers' rights would decrease employment. Higher minimum wages do not decrease employment. We've all read Carden-Crager. I've all read the Carden-Crager study. We know that this isn't true. This has been expanded on by Cengiz and Dubé and all of those other people, right? Labour economists have continually disproven the idea that better workers' rights and higher worker pay leads to further unemployment. That's just not the case. Especially if you're running an expansionary budget off the back of it chasing full employment. It's just not true. And even then, you could theoretically say you weren't engaging in an expansionary policy and there was some ways in which the employment reduced because of increased workers' rights. Again, no empirical evidence to be able to show that. You could have a federal jobs guarantee on top of that as well to ensure full employment. So there is even other policies that people could be doing to undermine the point that Jeremy Hunt is making here. But luckily, Carden-Craig have already proven, in the case of minimum wage, that an increased minimum wage doesn't actually lead to lower unemployment. I think it has to be maximum 80% of median wage for it to start having disemployment effects.
We have plans to bring taxes down. They want to spend more. So there is that contrast with Labour, but it's not going to be about gimmicks.
Plan on non-DOMs and making it harder for non-DOMs to avoid paying tax here, perfectly legally under the current rules. You would be carrying out a screaming U-turn. Do you deny that that's your plan?
I'm not going to talk about any individual taxes, and I thought that was a dance that we weren't going to do this morning. But what I will tell you is that I do want to find a way to bring down the tax burden as a Conservative. I think that will be the right way to unlock growth in the economy, but I'll do so in a way that is responsible. I won't do so through borrowing. I won't do so through gimmicks. I will do the right thing.
True, all of that responsible non-borrowing has gone really well for 14 years of anemic growth and recession right now. All of that fiscal prudence of not borrowing any money and slashing funding for public services It makes our country look great that our hospitals can't keep up with demand and school roofs are collapsing. This looks like fiscal prudence to me, Jeremy.
In the long-term interests of this country's economic growth.
And what about doing what Sir Roccaforte thinks is the right thing for the tourist industry in this country? I mean, should he be looking forward to Wednesday?
Well, I want to do everything I can to support the tourism industry. I won't talk about Wednesday, but in the autumn statement, we cut business rates on retail, hospitality and leisure businesses by 75% this year. That I think has given a real boost to a very important sector. So, in principle, anything I can do to help business, I want to, because this is going to be a budget for long-term growth.
What a lot of people watching now are concerned about as well is not just how inflation has eaten away at their wages. Everybody knows that when they go to the shop every week, things just have gone up and up and up and up. And although it's slowed down, and you've made that point already, there is, though, also a strong sense shared by many people in the country at the moment that public services are just creaking in many places, not nearly good enough. And maybe, if you have any spare cash, that's where money should go. Jonathan Hughes, one of our viewers, has said to us, Joe and Jill Citizen do not want lower taxes. They would rather that services of all sorts are provided and improved. What do you say?
I mean, it's frustrating because that is the sentiment that is kind of the median voter opinion in terms of fiscal policy in this country. I just find it frustrating that the BBC, I mean, it's right that they're trying to find a person whose view can get represented on the show, but that can be dismissed as an individual point. That can be dismissed as just, well, this is what this Jonathan person wants, as opposed to saying, okay, this is an example of what somebody says. And also, if we look at this polling also shows that broadly people want this too. In fact, a plurality of Conservative voters want extra quote-unquote fiscal fedrum put into public services rather than tax cuts. So there isn't even an appetite for what you're doing here, and it's not a responsible growth budget. All it is a bribery budget that doesn't even work in its own premise.
Say to him.
Well, what I say to Jonathan is I think what most people want is better public services and a lower tax burden. It's the old thing, isn't it? Can we have European public services and American levels of tax? The only way that we have a chance of delivering something like that is by spending the money that we spend on public services much more efficiently. Now, I know we're going to talk about productivity later, but if I could just give you one example, a nurse.
Keep talking about finding these efficiency savings. You've been looking for them for 14 years, mate. I don't think you're going to be able to find these so-called efficiency savings now if you haven't found them since 2010 when you promised you'd find them and instead just cut service provision.
Typically, nurses will say they spend up to a third of their time filling out forms rather than looking after patients. Police officers say that they will spend perhaps 8 hours a week on unnecessary paperwork. I think we have to think not about the money we're putting in, but whether we can do things more efficiently so that we get more out. And I think for people working on the front line who work extremely hard, they would find their jobs much more rewarding if we rethink our whole approach to public spending.
But successive chancellors have made promises about improving productivity, which in normal language is spending taxpayers' money properly. I mean, it doesn't say much for Conservative government's ability to spend taxpayers' money properly. 14 years into power, you were sitting there saying, the answer is in being able to spend cash better.
Well, that's not.
I mean, literally the point that I made already. I can't believe that I've beaten Laura Kuenssberg to the punch. I also can't believe that she made a salient point. Exactly what I was saying before. Where are these efficiencies if you haven't found them now?
Not what we're saying. In fact, 14 years in power and violent crime has halved. Our reading standards in schools were behind France, Germany and Sweden. They're now ahead. We have more than 40,000 additional doctors in the NHS. And ahead of the pandemic, between 2010 and 2019, productivity in the public sector was increasing by around 1% a year. All I'm saying is we need to get back to that. The pandemic stopped it. But if we are going to square this circle of better public services and reducing the tax burden, we need to restart the programme of public service.
Also, more investment into the systems that we have for the NHS, right? Just actual investment in NHS service provision was what we should have needed. Actual capital investment. More staffing is fine, it's good. We should be having more staff. I'm glad that we have more staff, but we also need more capacity for that staff to use. And we are still short of staff because we also have had loads of people leave the sector as well.
Reform that we had before the pandemic.
So essentially, that's one of the things that has gone wrong, you believe, is that the pandemic put the brakes on government looking to make taxpayers' money be spent better?
Yes, not everywhere. I'll give you one example. The Passport Office, a couple of years ago, there were huge problems for people getting their passports. They have completely turned that round. I think it's one of the most efficient passport services anywhere in the world. And
oh, wow. Oh, that very, very tiny section of government, I'm sure that's really making people feel like the sunlit uplands are just around the fucking corner, Jeremy. I sounded like Mark Corrigan there. That almost sounded like that could have been in a Peep Show script.
when you make those kind of changes, it's more rewarding for the people delivering those services, it's much better for the public, and it's cheaper for taxpayers. And that's what we have to restart. And that's why improving the way we spend money, the efficiency of money, is going to be absolutely key if we want to reduce the tax burden.
It's interesting they say, well, we need all these efficiency savings by cutting back on unnecessary red tape. How about unnecessary CEOs? How about unnecessary directors? How about unnecessary shareholder dividends? All of these unnecessary pieces of private profit from the over-privatised level to which we subcontract out NHS provision to other people, when these could all be done in-house at cost with no CEOs and no shareholder dividends and no profits to pay out. That's a thing that we could have done, but we didn't do. That is an inefficiency, but I don't think that's the inefficiency that he means when he says it. Also, one last thing on the fiscal efficiency standpoint, making efficiency savings, ensuring our money is spent well. Jeremy, do you think tens of millions of pounds for Michelle Moe was money spent well? Do you think crony PPE contracts that didn't deliver functional stock is money spent well? Do you think this is efficient use of taxpayers' money? Was it efficient use of taxpayers' money to give PPE contracts to Matt Hancock's mate from the pub? And you may say, well, I wasn't Chancellor then. First of all, the party that you represent are in power. Like, it's still your problem to put right and recoup those funds. Second of all, the Chancellor at the time is literally your Prime Minister. So honestly, you are still to blame for all of this. You are a representative of the government, headed by the man who organised the crony contracts for PPE during the pandemic.
I think there are some people in your party who are really concerned about the size of the state. And the state has been growing and growing and growing.
What state? What state do we have left? I can't believe that this is the line she's going with. The state is, state spending might be increasing, but the actual amount of state intervention in the economy is still incredibly low in this country. Private water, private mail, private rail, private energy, private buses, private waste disposal. Like, it's still provided by the state, but it's all subcontracted out to private firms. Right? Like, local authorities used to do their own waste management. Now it's all Veolia Limited doing our waste disposal on crappier contracts for those engaging in the work to pay for the profits of those private companies. What state? Council budgets have been cut by 40%. What state assets or locally owned assets are being forced to get sold off to pay for budget cuts in councils? So all of your local amenities, your swimming pools, your libraries, your parks, your youth centres, they're all going to be owned by multinational private equity firms. What state has been growing? Crazy. Absolutely crazy. That's the line that she's going with.
Is it really a good idea? Is it compatible with your ambition for us to be a lower tax country if you keep growing what the state offers?
It is, because that is the gross cost, not the net cost. When you look at the economic impact of having more people in work, higher GDP, more taxes being paid, what you find actually is this is very, very cost-effective measure. And, if I give you an example, if we had...
And yet here's Jeremy Hunt having to defend the idea of state spending being a good thing against somebody who's explicitly taken a state equals bad position when interviewing. Because, at least Jeremy Hunt is smart enough to know that most people in this country actually really like state spending. It's really funny. I keep a close eye on a bunch of the hacks from the think tanks. And one thing that you hear a lot, especially from people like the IEA, is the idea that the British public are just wrong because they like state spending. Christian Niemetz, who was a political economist for the Institute of Economic Affairs, would describe a lot of the British public as if they were communist. He literally called the British public communists because they like state spending so much. Now, I don't think that's true, but I do think that he's broadly right that the UK population does really like state spending. They like big state. They like public services. The polling shows it. 70% of the country broadly want rail, mail, energy and water all in public hands, against the interests of people like the Institute of Economic Affairs, and indeed the Conservative Party, and indeed our political journalists. But at least Jeremy Hunt is here to say, well, actually, if I just said the things that you're saying, people would dislike me more because that's not outside of public opinion. So I'm at least going to acquiesce to public opinion on the idea that state spending isn't necessarily a bad thing.
Same female participation rate as, let me put it in better language, the same number of women working as they do in Holland, we would have more than 2 million extra people in the workforce. That would mean a much bigger GDP, much less talent wasted, a much more prosperous country.
Let's talk then, though, about the prosperity of the country. And I want to show viewers something that is really important, and it's sometimes quite hard to get your head around. But this is the size of the country's debt now. And you can see there, 2019, before pandemic, it was about 80%, already high by historic proportions. Now, it's nearly the size of the whole economy. Now, there are lots of people in your party, probably lots of people watching this morning, who look at that and just think, that is horrifying. Now, before you say it, I know, of course, the books have been battered by COVID, battered then by the shock of the conflict in Ukraine. Liz Truss's adventures with the financial markets didn't help the situation either. But as a Conservative Chancellor, how can you be comfortable with that level of debt?
Well, I'm not. And that's
the entire premise of all of the question that she's asked here is under the assumption that public sector debt is de facto bad. I mentioned this on Navarra, I'll mention it again here. Go read Simon Wren-Lewis's blog. He does really much better work than explaining this than I would. But there is no empirical evidence. There is no empirical evidence anywhere to tell you that a country with a high debt to GDP ratio is necessarily a bad economy, right? And there is nothing necessarily bad about having a high debt to GDP ratio. That doesn't tell you anything about the health of the economy. For example, France has a higher debt to GDP ratio than we do, yet their economy is healthier because the actual material outcomes of their economy are better. Italy has a lower debt to GDP ratio than we do, yet Italy broadly understood to be the other sick man of Europe, quote unquote. So this idea that there's correlation between an economy being bad and having a high debt to GDP ratio is just a nonsense. And I know, right, that the BBC know that they have a poor time understanding this, because they literally did their own internal review. For example, we think too many journalists lack basic understanding of basic economics or lack confidence reporting in it. This brings a high risk to impartiality. In the period of this review, it particularly affected debt. Some journalists seem to feel instinctively that debt is simply bad, full stop, and don't appear to realise this can be contested and is contestable, and is also just wrong. This is an internal review the BBC did into their own journalists, and found that they make incorrect assumptions about how debt is in the economy. They know that what Laura Kuenssberg is saying here is explicitly biased, or at least implicitly biased, in the misunderstanding that she has. And they're not even doing any work to get her to change her position on this. Because she could literally frame all of this and say, well, you promised to reduce the debt to GDP ratio in the 5 pledges Rishi Sunak made at the start of 2023. It's now 2024, and all of the projections show that it's going up, and it has already gone up. So you've broken this pledge. So given that you think that you've made financially prudent decisions over this past year, would you admit then that actually this pledge shouldn't have been made and that there was prudence in letting it go up in the short term? She could have phrased it like that. Or she could have just said, is it actually bad? Is there any problem with this? The real problem is the recession that we're in, not the debt to GDP ratio.
Talk about COVID and indeed the cost of living crisis, and we spent hundreds of billions of pounds supporting families. I think that was the right thing to do. And by the way, since 2010, we have had 800 more people in work for every single day the Conservatives have been in office. And we've kept unemployment at historic lows because of those decisions. But now the pandemic is behind us, we have to start bringing down that debt prudently and responsibly. And that is what you'll see on Wednesday.
But when you talk about bringing down the debt, by the end of the 5-year forecast, you try to avoid the technical term, by the end of the 5-year period for which you produce numbers, it's only projected to be coming down by a whisker. Do you think that perhaps you need to do something much more radical to confront the scale of that?
Well,
it's incredible that this is the framing that she's using, especially since when she was talking to the panel that she has, which includes a right-winger, a business owner, an ex-Bank of England banker, and then a centre-left housing correspondent. All 3 of them agreed that the reduction of debt to GDP over the 5-year period fiscal rule has to get ditched in favour of higher investment. She's been given that political position by a broad spectrum of people from different political positions, and she's still not changing the line of questioning to say, well, actually, if you really want to get debt down, you need to propose radical debt reduction, radical deficit reduction, even more austerity. She's priming him to give a pro-austerity answer after being told by a broad spectrum of people who knows more about this than she does, that actually all of this is bad. I lose my mind. I'm honestly losing my mind. We pay for this shit. Our license fee, our tax money, that shit all pays for her to be here being the consent manufacturer for neoliberalism.
It's coming down significantly compared to the levels that were predicted when I became Chancellor. And the balancing act that I have is that, as I know Andy Haldane will agree, one of the most effective ways to bring down debt is to grow the economy. Now, we have a plan that people like the International Monetary Fund say will see the British economy growing faster than any large European economy over the next
pretty anemic.
Well, it'll grow faster than France, Germany or Italy or in fact Japan over the next 5 years. We need to stick with that plan.
Also, grow for whom? Who is the economy going to be growing for? Is it going to be asset holders? Is it going to be workers? Well, it's not going to be the second, is it? It's not going to be the second because you're not going to be the ones who are going to implement demand-side labour reform to allow better bargaining terms for workers so that they can get higher wages. Most of the economic growth that we had over the last 14 years was just growth in asset prices because you gave money through quantitative easing to rich people to be able to pour liquidity into asset prices to increase them to generate economic growth, even though productivity was stagnant for that entire period. The way we actually need to get to the point where we get higher productivity is through higher investment, and that's going to have to come from the state, and you're not even promising to do that. God, can we just have a normal human being who knows how economic works on these programs? The entire line of questioning about why are you not being more right-wing on the economy, why are you not doing more austerity, why are you still doing something closer to what the public wants, even though it's not? Why are you even further away from public opinion on these things? No left-wing line of economic questioning. They always leave it out. They always remove it from any discussion of economics. It's infuriating. It's absolutely maddening. Just like in our question time, there's never any lefty economists, are there? No, right? Even though the people who are left-wing from left-wing parties make good economic arguments, they never get trade unionists or left-wing economists on that programme. It's always sociologists or people from charities. Hey there, if you enjoyed the video, make sure that you like and leave a comment. That helps the video out in the algorithm. If you subscribe and ring the bell, it'll let you know when I go live. I stream every day on YouTube and Twitch. You can also follow all of my socials down in the description. And if you want to support me in a more financial manner, there's a join button for membership. It's just 99p to be a member on YouTube, as well as a Patreon, and there's some merch there as well. And hopefully I'll catch you on the next video. Take care.